the resistance has very effectively switched from what were initially guerrilla tactics to conventional offensives. And the regime has proven itself totally incapable of learning from its own inadequacies and its own mistakes and changing tactics. The regime keeps using a losing strategy where it forces a hunker down in their bases to just stick it out for as long as possible with minimal supplies, minimal food, ammunition, until an inevitable surrender.
This is a conversation with Thomas Van Linge, a freelance journalist and a researcher who covers the world's forgotten conflicts, including the civil war in Myanmar, where a pro-democracy movement is fighting against the military regime. Thomas recently took a research trip to the rebel-held areas, spent time on the front lines and in rebel bases, and saw the conflict firsthand and up close. And in this conversation, we talk about what this civil war looks like. How are rebels without heavy equipment able to win over a conventional military? Or whether this could be one of the rare cases where a moderate pro-democracy movement ends up winning. Thank you to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, can we maybe start by, introducing yourself? What do you do and how you got to covering the conflict in Myanmar and reporting directly from the ground from over there?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a conflict reporter and researcher. And I tend to focus most on conflicts that's sort of considered a bit forgotten conflicts by others. So, where most researchers tend to focus on Ukraine and the war in Gaza, I tend to focus more than on the wars in Myanmar, Sudan, beforehand also the war in Tigray, in Ethiopia. And through that, I sort of combine both on-the-ground reporting and reporting through OSINT methods, through the information that's available through open source intelligence. And this past month, I traveled to Thailand and then Myanmar for a first sort of trip to the front lines in Myanmar and to do some actual underground reporting from that country.
So you said it yourself that Myanmar is a little bit of a forgotten conflict. And I think that an average person, even if they are perhaps following, geopolitics and what's going on in the world, might not know that much about what's been happening in Myanmar and perhaps have not been following it very closely. So could you maybe start by giving a bit of a context and trying to, even though I know, it's very complex, if you could try to briefly explain the background of the conflict and where it started and how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, I just used the word forgotten conflict, but I sometimes even wonder if that's an appropriate word to use, because in order to forget about a conflict, you first need to have known about it. And I feel with the case of Myanmar, it is sometimes not even like the case in that country. But yeah, because I think why so few people know about situations in Myanmar is sort of the time period in when it really started. Myanmar, since independence, has had on and off military rule in the country. But from the period of 2010 until 2021, there was a brief opening, a brief period of gradual democratization, civil politics, still, of course, with the military maintaining a lot of influence in politics, influential positions throughout the state. A civil government was allowed to take form. That was up until the parliamentary elections of November of 2020, when the political party of opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi won a landslide victory throughout the country, and the political party that had been established by the military itself in order to retain their political influence was dealt a crushing defeat. And then that resulted in a couple months of political tensions, and that escalated then into a full-blown military coup in February of 2021. That was during the global pandemic, so across the world, countries and people were more, concerned with their own situations and not really having the space to focus on what's happening in a country like Myanmar. And the military was sort of counting on this. They were thinking, because everyone is involved with themselves, we can just sort of take power again, and nobody will really bat an eye on it. We can just sort of have a clear path here to do it. But what they didn't calculate in that decision was the people themselves. Because, after 10 years of sort of democratization, of a gradual opening up to the world, many Burmese citizens had sort of, gotten a sense of what it's like to live in a civil democratic society. They have basically come of age in the world of social media, of the internet, of tourists coming to visit. So after those 10 years, things would not go back to the way it was before democratization. It would not go back to the way it was back in the 70s or 80s when there was a military dictatorship. So across the country, there was suddenly a massive anti-coup revolution. Like major cities, thousands, sometimes millions of people would go to the streets to protest. And the military had no way to respond to this protest aside from responding very violently, shooting protesters, arresting thousands of protesters, torture, arrests, kidnappings, intimidation. And in their very, standard response for trying to simply crush a revolution, they basically drove the many thousands of young protesters to flee their homes and to head to remote mountain regions, jungles, border regions, where they would form these resistance cells. And then, the uprising against the military dictatorship and against the coup, which basically started as a peaceful civil uprising, slowly transformed into a armed resistance movement.
I wonder how did that happen? Because I think, starting an armed resistance movement against a relatively competent military is not an easy thing. So I assume there was already a bit of some kind of a background that the people who were uprising against the military junta were able to take advantage of.
Yes, Myanmar is a very ethnically, religiously, culturally diverse country, and there are over 150 different recognized ethnicities. And many of these ethnicities, throughout the decades since independence, had at times risen up against the military dictatorship. They had their own armed factions, their own rebel forces. And even though the majority of these forces were relatively minor at the time of the coup, they were still in existence, and they did already have these decades of experience in armed struggle. During the brief period of democratization, almost all these factions were in ongoing peace talks with the civil government of Aung San Suu Kyi. But then when the coup happened, all bets were off, and suddenly these EAOs, as they are known, ethnic armed organizations, were finding themselves in a whole new political situation and with a whole new influx of new recruits, not just from their own ethnic backgrounds, but also from the Bama majority, like the dominant ethnic force in the country. All these students and young people from the cities who came to join these ethnic areas, to join these armed forces and to, get weapons, get training, and to sort of join ranks against this military regime.
So let's maybe talk about your recent trip where, if I'm correct, you were able to visit the rebels, spend time with them, visit the front lines, see what the uprising actually looks like up close. So, how was it? What did you see? And what were your main takeaways from seeing the conflict on the ground? And I guess as compared to where you were when you were watching it before, from distance?
Yes, so the region that I went to is the state of Karenni. And Karenni, when you look at the entirety of Myanmar, is actually a very small state. It's only like 10,000, 11,000 square kilometers. When you compare it to the other states, it's by far the smallest. It looks a bit just like a dot on the map. But it is a very strategic state in that it is located only 80 kilometers from the capital, Naypyidaw. And on top of that, it was also one of the most rebellious areas after the coup. So what you saw in Karenni was that on the grassroots level, the Karenni people, which are one of the ethnic groups in the country, really mobilized themselves. They formed these different resistance cells and they started attacking the military. And in the 3 years since the coup was committed, they gradually shifted their tactics from sporadic guerrilla attacks to really conventional warfare. And when I was in Karenni, approximately 90% of the state was already in the hands of the resistance. The troops of the regime were still there, but they were mostly isolated in their hilltop camps and bases on some like crossroads in the state or in some major towns. So basically, the rebels have almost complete freedom of movement. They dominate the majority of the state. They have their camps everywhere. They provide for the people. And they're now in a process where they're sort of taking out the different remaining regime camps one after the other. And it's still a very slow process because the people in Karenni have no major outside support. They really have to, fund and support their own armed rebellion. So even though they outnumber the remaining regime forces in the state by 8-1, 10-1, they still can't, deliver a quick victory because they simply don't have the weapons and the ammunition. All their supplies are what they managed to capture from regime forces in the past, and they really have to be very sober and careful with the remaining supplies that they have.
Well, that was sort of my next question. How do you, if you do have sort of a grassroots rebel movement, how do you fight against a military regime which I assume has overwhelming firepower on their side, and they have, air force and heavy weapons that the rebel movement just doesn't have?
Yeah, those are definitely the advantages of the regime. I would say that the resistance, especially in Karenni, has different advantages. They are all, or mostly from Karenni itself, so they have the knowledge of the terrain, they have the local support, and on top of that, another vital aspect, they have the motivation. The regime forces, especially in Karenni, are very demotivated. You hear often these stories that whenever regime soldiers were captured, that like the average age of the prisoners was 40 years, 50 years, while all the resistance fighters are like between 16 and 30 years old. So it's also definitely a big generation gap between the different sides. And, it was not an easy fight for the resistance, even in such a small area as Karenni. After 3 years of armed struggle, they still haven't fully taken the state yet. So it's a very slow and gradual process, but it's still on the benefit of the resistance, and they still have the upper hand in that area. Of course, the junta can respond with their scorched earth tactics. When I was there, we drove through countless villages which have been burned to the ground, bombed, hit by artillery. But that's basically the only advantage that the regime has, and that it's not enough to, crush a rebellion and keep their hold over this rebellious province.
How does it work, since you said that there's a number of different, or maybe you've mentioned it in your reporting, that there is a number of different groups. Some of them are ethnic, some of them are not, that are fighting against the government. And often, even in one place, there is a number of different factions. And I wonder, how does it work between them, whether they are able to work together, whether they're able to coordinate, and whether that's an advantage for them or a disadvantage in terms of um, having a multiple factions rather than a single unified movement.
I think it's important to stress that Myanmar is a huge country. It's um, much larger than Ukraine. I think maybe it was twice the size. But because it's spread out, you wouldn't necessarily guess that. And the different regions of Myanmar, different states, all have very specific dynamics. So it's sort of the logic works differently in every state. Some states, for example, Rakhine on the border with Bangladesh, there's really only one group that dominates the entire struggle, the Arakan army. In another state like Karen, which also borders Thailand, there is the Karen National Liberation Army, which is the dominant force in the region, but also cooperates with sort of more local, smaller resistance cells. But there is still a very hierarchical dynamic in that state. And in Karenni, it's all very horizontally based and grassroots. There are many different factions, both ethnic Karenni factions, but also more multi-ethnic People's Resistance Force groups, as they are called. And they all work on a very horizontal basis. There's like no clear chain of command there. There's no like specific leaders there. Like there's no Karenni Che Guevara as they set themselves. And that's a really distinguishing factor of how the Karenni fights the regime. And in that state, it has proven very effective in, really keeping the grassroots level, really keeping the local support, and managing to attack the regime from different sides. But the disadvantage is because they really have to do everything themselves. They can't call on a larger, more established ethnic army for weapons and ammunition as other resistance cells in other parts of the countries, which have sort of taken a subordinate position, are able to.
I gotta say, I am ashamed of my geographic knowledge, but I had no idea that Myanmar is that big. At least on the map, it looks much smaller. But I guess hearing you talk about it, I think from what I've heard so far, I had this idea that what's going on in the Myanmar is sort of this that it's basically the military junta versus a pro-democracy movement. But from what you're saying, it sounds like there's maybe actually a lot more different smaller conflicts going on, all against the same enemy, and to an extent a lot of them seem to be ethnic groups which are maybe fighting more for their own independence rather than for a change of a regime in the entire country. So which is the right way, from your opinion, to look at this conflict?
I think there's truth in both. I would say that the overall theme is, as you describe, the pro-democracy uprising against the military regime. Had we looked at Myanmar 30 years ago, 40 years ago, before democratization, it was more the logic of ethnic minorities trying to break free from the state of Burma and trying to fight for more autonomy or even independence. But with the coup, that logic sort of changed, because suddenly also the Bamar themselves, the dominant ethnic group in the country, picked up arms against the regime. And that sort of, drove all these Bamar students and protesters into the arms of ethnic rebels. And together they've sort of formed a unified front against the regime. And now the dominant logic among all the different factions is that we can only achieve something if we remove the current junta first, and afterwards we'll figure out our own grievances. And of course, it doesn't mean that there are no ethnic conflicts or tensions, But I would say for the moment, it's mostly, under the surface. It's passive, and it could definitely come up to the surface in a post regime age. You always think of other countries where such a thing happens, like in Libya or Somalia, where regional strifes and competition eventually, tore the country apart. But for the moment, there is no clear indication that such a case will be the case in Myanmar. It seems that for the moment, the different groups, the different armed factions, different ethnicities are willing to work together, and that the NUG, the National Unity Government, which is sort of a government in exile set up by the remnants of Aung San Suu Kyi's civil government, they are very sort of willing to listen to the grievances of the ethnic minorities. Because, as we discussed before, it is these ethnic armed organizations that have basically kept the anti-coup movement alive, that have supplied the new recruits with weapons, with training. So for the longest time, the Bama, when they wanted to continue the struggle against regime, were dependent on these ethnic minorities to support them and to, provide refuge and trading and whatever. So there will be some sort of debt to pay from their end as well when this regime will fall.
And do you think that, in your opinion, that will have a form of these groups pursuing independence and maybe forming their own states independent of the centralized Myanmar state?
I think if they could really have their own way, I could imagine that some of these different groups would want their own states, but that's what they ideally would want. And that's very different from the reality they're still in. Even in a post-regime, post-junta age, you still have to deal with neighbors like India, like China, countries who have their own separatist regions, who are really not excited about the prospects of some sort of, example being set in Myanmar of that country falling apart. So I think really, if and when the regime will fall, the international community and especially regional players will really pressure all the different ethnic armies, ethnic groups to stay in Myanmar and to sort of figure out how to live together in a new state. It could probably be some sort of federated democracy. That's already what, the NUG and several of the ethnic armies have committed themselves to. And I don't actually see that there will be new independent states arising from Myanmar, at least not unilaterally. Maybe if there will be some sort of agreement with a new government in Naypyidaw, but I definitely won't see any major separatist conflicts arising from the fall of the regime.
Is there some significant support for the military regime? Because I assume that someone has to be supporting it within the country, otherwise it would have fallen much sooner.
Well, domestically, yes and no. Like, no in the sense of that among the general population, support for the military is really low. But what the military has done over the decades since they have controlled the country is that they basically created a parallel society. So, like, the current soldiers in the regime have been fighting in the regime all their lives and are often the children of soldiers, of other veterans themselves. Like, every regime base in Myanmar, especially in the border regions, it's not just a base, it's basically a small town. Soldiers live in the base, but also their wives and their children. And this has been a very deliberate strategy of the regime in order to sort of separate their troops from the general population, create this parallel society from which they can guarantee loyalty. And, even if soldiers would want to defect from that regime, it will be very hard when their wives and children are still kept at those bases as hostages in a way. And in that sort of sense, the regime has maintained a lot of troops, soldiers, and now that is slowly disintegrating. But that is what's keeping their war effort going so far.
There's also, if we're talking about supporters of the regime, there is the role of external powers, which I think is really interesting. And it seems to me, from what I've been able to find out, there's mainly the role of Russia and China that play important roles in this conflict. So let's talk about Russia first, because the way I understand it, it has been the main supporter of the military regime, and they've been supplying them with weapons that they need to keep the fight going. So why is Russia supporting the military dictatorship, and how important is their support for their survival?
When we come to the question of why, I think it's the very simple zero-sum logic that the Kremlin has always maintained in geopolitics. They would consider the civil government of Aung San Suu Kyi as friendly to the West, so then they automatically support the opponent of that, like the regime that will be hostile to the US or to Western values and such a thing. And in the sense of how important Russian support is I think it plays a role, but it's not enough to keep the regime alive. I think that when we would involve Myanmar into Russia's global strategy, we could already see this affect a bit of global overstretch. Russia is fighting in Ukraine. It is involved in the Sahel countries. It is trying to, keep regimes afloat from Syria to Venezuela to Cuba. And, it simply does not have enough resources to maintain another insurgency and to keep the regime alive in Myanmar itself, because those resources also need to be used elsewhere. In that sense, a Russian intervention in Myanmar, as we, for example, saw in the war in Syria on behalf of President Assad, is unthinkable for those logistical reasons. And also, and this is where China comes into play, is that China considers Myanmar its own background. And China would not tolerate Russia to interfere in its own backyard in that sense. So also something like a Wagner mission to Myanmar is very unlikely, because that's simply not what Beijing would like. And here we can already see sort of this internal competition between Russia and China. We always think that these countries are aligned, but they're only aligned as much as their interests match. And in Myanmar, that is not very necessarily the case. China, for the moment, is very apathetic towards the Myanmar regime. Of course, it would not like Myanmar to be a flourishing democracy. But the other reality is that China did have good relationships with the civil government of Aung San Suu Kyi, especially on a personal level. Xi Jinping and Aung San Suu Kyi, got along pretty well. They could make trade agreements. And there comes the factor that China is very opportunistic when it comes to its foreign policy. China usually tends to support the stronger side. When the coup was committed, there were some indications that Chinese intelligence officers helped the Myanmar regime in taking power, probably because at the time they made the same calculation that the military regime itself had made, that they would just grab power, they would be unrest for a couple of weeks, and then it would die down and everything would just go back to normal. And they didn't expect the protest movements to morph into this nationwide resistance. And I think now the Chinese are a bit like, we're not going to, commit many resources, money, even troops to save a lost cause, to sort of try to save this regime. Of course, there's also a lot of distrust between the Myanmar Junta and the Chinese because of ethnic strifes. That's a whole different story. But I think now China is just watching the situation closely, seeing which way it will go, and also watching what the West will do. I think actually, paradoxically, the fact that the Myanmar resistance it's not supported very fundamentally by Western powers with weapons and ammunition and supplies might actually be beneficial to the resistance, because it will not elicit a counter response by the Chinese. if the Chinese would see some sort of American regime change up in Myanmar, then they'll probably force their hands to support the junta. But if they are seeing that the West is not really involved in this conflict, then it does not really give them a reason to get involved themselves.
Well, that was my next question. So there's no Western involvement on the side of any form of support of the pro-democracy movement.
Yeah, in the US, they did pass in Congress the Burma Act, which would allow for non-lethal aid to reach the different Burmese resistance groups. But in the first place, non-lethal aid was not really what was needed there. And aside from that, I have not really heard of any initiatives being launched since the passing of this act. So I think more the support that the Burmese resistance groups are getting from the West is just, moral support, that Western diplomats are willing to meet with the national unity government and its representatives, that if the regime would fall, that they would probably be eager to recognize this government and work together with it in order to build a democracy. But they're not looking to get involved militarily or to support the different resistance groups in any way. Is it because of disinterest, or is it because they don't want to provoke Russia and China? Is it because, they have their hands full on Ukraine as well? I think it's a bit of all these factors. And I do think that especially the Americans, they would be willing to support the Burmese resistance, but I think they have learned their lessons as well from Syria. Like if you want to support an armed rebellion, you either have to go all the way or don't do it, because chances are you probably just spoke a counter response from your global rivals, Russia or China, who are willing to go far further in how much you want to get involved in the conflicts than you would.
I think it's interesting, the comparison with the Syrian civil war, because I see also from the Western perspective, one of the main issues was that apart from the pro-democracy movements, there was quite a lot of radical Islamic movements that were also fighting against the regime, but they wanted things that were not aligned with what the West would have wanted at all. And I wonder if there is anything like that in Myanmar, or whether it's everyone who's fighting against the military dictatorship or military regime has sort of this, broad alignment on democratic values, and maybe even pro-Western direction of the country.
They will all claim that they would have this commitment to democracy, but you also have to look at how they operate in the areas they control. And there are some groups that have shown problematic behavior, not necessarily in the sense of any religious extremism, but you have seen, for example, that the Arakan army, which mostly based on the Buddhist Rakhine people, there have been reports of ethnic discrimination of the Rohingya Muslims, the Muslim minority of Rakhine, who had been pushed out of the country mostly in 2017. There have been other groups in Shan State, which is a state bordering Thailand and China, where there have been reports of repression, of extortions. Some of these groups, for example, one of these groups is based off ethnic Chinese. There's also a small region in Myanmar which is majority on Chinese. And this group has actually very close ties to the People's Liberation Army in China, and is sort of now modeling CCP rule in their small enclave in Myanmar. So definitely some of these groups may claim to fight for a federal multi-ethnic democracy, but in practice really show some authoritarian ways of running things.
Another thing that's, I think, very interesting is the role of Aung San Suu Kyi, if I'm pronouncing it more or less correctly. Because you've mentioned that China sees her as someone that they could make an arrangement with, but she also used to be sort of a darling of the West, and she won a Nobel Peace Prize, if I'm correct. And she was a dissident against the former military dictatorship for a long time. So I wonder if you could maybe explain sort of who she is and what's her role in the and reputation in Myanmar, and what would be her role if the military regime eventually falls, and whether she has the support of the people in the country.
Yeah, Aung San Suu Kyi was really known for a long time as sort of the Burmese Nelson Mandela. Being the daughter of sort of the main hero of Burmese independence, she lived in exile during most of the military dictatorship until she returned during the 1980s, became the figure of another peaceful anti-regime revolution, and she spent about 20 something years under house arrest in the capital Yangon. When she was released in 2010 because of Western pressure and sanctions, she and her party, the NLD, they were the ones that then won landslide after landslide in every election in which they participated in, like up to 80-90% of all the votes. And they were basically the ones running the whole civil government. There was no coalition building. There were no other parties to negotiate with. They could really run their own show. So she really was the most powerful figure in all of Burmese society, and the biggest threat to the power that the military regime had. And then the coup took place. Her government was overthrown, and she was put in prison again. And during the first few weeks of the anti-coup protest, there were portraits of her everywhere. People would get tattoos of her face on their body as a sign of solidarity. But as the uprising progressed and turned into an armed rebellion, more lives were lost. People made sacrifices. People went to the jungle and became rebels. And all that time, she just remained in prison, sort of. In that sense, it was sort of out of sight, slowly out of mind. So now she becomes less and less relevant, I feel, as a sort of leading figure of the rebellion, because at this moment, as we speak, around half of the country has already been liberated by different resistance groups. And while this fighting took place, all these offensives, she was just sitting in jail. She didn't partake in any of these efforts. And aside from that, it's also a factor that, just like the ruling military regime, she is of the Bamar majority, the ethnic Bamars. So for the ethnic minorities, she was never really that hero figure anyways. And since they've taken a dominant position in this new rebellion, that has also led to her slow decrease in influence. In the West, she's still regarded as like the most famous Burmese politician. And it's funny to look at the news, at the way Myanmar is reported here in the West, that every news update about her, whether it's like she's going to court, she's being moved from a prison cell to house arrest, it's being reported in Western press, while all the frontline developments across the country are not. So this really shows sort of our priority in reporting on Myanmar. But I do think that when the regime will fall and she will inevitably be released, that she will be a hero to her loyal support base, but that she will have lost her hero status among the majority of the country, because people some people will say, where were you when we were dying to free our country, when we were making sacrifices? And aside from that, she's also, now in her 70s. Who knows how long the conflict will be, but she will only be older by the time she's set free. And it's really young people, like millennials and Gen Z, who are leading this liberation struggle. I don't think they'll be too eager with, being ruled again by this, this old person by the time that they have basically overthrown this regime themselves.
And also her perception in the West has quite radically changed even before the coup, because of her role in the genocide of the Rohingya Muslim minority in the country.
Yes, that was really her fall from grace here in the West. Like all her prestigious titles from like different universities and institutions were retracted. And, that was really her, in the eyes of us in the West, siding with the military oppressors. Ironically enough, and also a bit concerning enough, in Myanmar, that did not elicit the same kind of criticism, because the majority of the Burmese people felt mostly indifference to the fate of the Rohingya themselves. But that's changed very rapidly when the coup took place, and suddenly, it was not just the Rohingya they were facing the brunt of the regime's violence. It was the whole country. So there was sort of this national awakening about what the Rohingya had endured, and this maybe on a societal level, a reconciliation between the Burmese peoples, the different groups, and the Rohingya. But she never really had that that change of thought, or never had the opportunity to speak her thought about that. And the Rohingya will still always be a sort of huge black spot on her reputation, at least to us in that sense.
So let's maybe get back to the conflict and to the military aspect of what's happening on the ground. Because from your reporting that I've seen, it looks like the military is basically losing, and it's more or less a matter of time before they lose completely. Is that a correct assessment, or do you see it differently? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.